Good morning. Welcome to another Tuesday Tea-ology. I've got a Scottish breakfast tea here, good and strong, and we will continue our discussion, examination of the wonderful and mysterious attributes of God, the the characteristics of God, all in this picture that is beyond our ability to grasp. Because, as we discussed a couple weeks ago in the divine simplicity, these are not parts of God that we really take apart, but that the wonderful unity of God is too vast for us to look at all at once. And so we need to take things little by little because we are so small and God is so great. And in terms of the attributes of God, we have largely been going through the natural attributes of God, the attributes of God's greatness. And these attributes of God's greatness sometimes are just reminders that the limits do not apply to God, the limits that apply to creatures. And so last week we kind of gave a general overview of that in discussing this concept of God's infinity. That whereas we are limited in so many ways, God is not limited. Creaturely limitations do not apply to God because God is not a creature. God is the creator, and as the creator, he is bigger, he is greater than the things he has made. And so that's a general sort of logical concept you might have in mind as you think about all of these things. That a creator surpasses the creation, uh, and God, as the creator of all things, surpasses all things, and the limits on what He has created do not apply to Him. And today, we begin to work out that concept of God's infinity. We work it out in several aspects, and we'll take them one at a time. You can work it out in respect to space, in respect to time, in respect to knowledge, in respect to power, and so on. And beginning with space, that space is God's creature, and God is not limited by his creatures. That God's other creatures exist in space. It is the dimension of their existence, one of the dimensions, and it is not a dimension that is binding upon God the same way it is upon creatures. So, what does this mean? What does it mean to begin to say that God is not limited by space? What is space? Get your tea and take a big gulp and try to think about that. What is space? Space is the extension and measurement that allows objects to exist in relation to one another and to be different from each other. That we know what space is intuitively, but it becomes hard to explain it because it's the water you swim in, it's the space you live in. But space differentiates things. That one of the reasons I can say that myself and this mug of tea are not the same is that we are not in the same place. We are very close to each other. We get closer and closer. And in a way, this tea has entered into my space, but nonetheless, there are distinctions. And as it begins to become absorbed into me, some of those distinctions dissolve. But if there were no space, then there would be no distinction between different things. And we would not be able to separate ourselves from things. We would not be able to draw nearer or further. There would be no interaction. There would be no relationships because there would be no distinction. Space is a wonderful thing when you think about it. If there weren't, if I think I heard a definition of time, and we'll come to time, but it's the same kind of thing. A definition of time years ago, I read that God created time to keep everything from happening at once. Um, God created space so that there could be different things uh, uh, that are separated from each other, and to have relationships with each other and have this extension and distinction and difference. And space limits us in a lot of ways. We can only be in one place at a time. It limits us in terms of our ability to interact. You know, if I want to pick up a rock that's way over there, I have to travel all the way over there. And there are plenty of rocks that are so far away that I will never be able to reach them. I mean, if I committed myself, but there's rocks on other planets that are just beyond my reach. When you're a small child, you learn this about space, that space means some things are too high up and you can't reach them. As you grow older, you learn that that's just a universal rule. Some things are too high up in the universe and you cannot reach them. So space limits us. And we can't be everywhere. Sometimes that's troublesome. Reports come to us and so and so did this and this. And how do we know that it's true? We weren't there. We were somewhere else. We may, we have reliable reports that we may trust. We may have evidence presented to us. We might have a video that sort of moves us across space, as it were, our presence. But in this day and age, while videos were always things you couldn't trust, especially now, my goodness, they're getting good at faking things. So space creates certain limits on us in various ways, but space does not limit God because space is His creature for the distinguishing of His creatures from one another and to allow them to be different from each other and to interact, and He surpasses it. So we begin to talk about God in relation to space. And there's two key words that you want to bear in mind. The first of them is God's immensity. And if you've taken theology before, you may not have encountered that one. The second one is God's omnipresence, and that one is more commonly talked about. But God's immensity is sort of the first stage. God is immense, literally immense. Why do I say literally? Because we use the word immense, and we use the word immense meaning really big, meaning huge. Oh, there was just, we came upon these immense mountains, just seemed to reach to the sky. But when we do that, when we use the word immense, meaning really huge, we're speaking hyperbolically. We may not know we're speaking hyperbolically, but we are, because what the word literally means is that it is unmeasurable, that you cannot measure it. Immense, you cannot measure it. And God is literally unmeasurable. So when we come to the book of First Kings, chapter 8, verse 27, Solomon is dedicating the temple, and he recognizes that while this temple is sort of the dwelling place of God, in another sense, the concept is unfathomable. He says in 1 Kings 8:27, "But will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you. How much less this house that I have built?" And so Solomon, as he's dedicating the temple, realizes that God's presence may be perceived or particularly recognized in certain places. A space may be dedicated to him, may be dedicated by him and set apart, but at the same time, uh, the highest heavens cannot contain him. God is immense, unmeasurable, and he is greater than all spaces. He is the Lord over space, sovereign over space. That's some of the conceptual kind of terminology of theologian John Frame puts this in the emphasis of God's sovereignty. God is sovereign over space. And that brings then to this idea of the omnipresence of God. So if God is sovereign over space, one of the things that means is that God is everywhere. God is not everything. There is distinction nonetheless because there is creatures, but God is everywhere. And this is the personal dimension. This is where, we've had the heady sort of intellectual musings and whatnot, and really fascinating to think about things you don't usually think about. But where does the rubber hit the road in terms of actual lived Christianity, in terms of our relationship to God? In terms of our hearts and spirits. That's when we particularly start talking about God's omnipresence. So whereas immensity is sort of a negative term, God is beyond measure. He can't be measured. God's omnipresence is a positive term. God is in every place. He is all present. He's present everywhere. And that is of value for conviction and for comfort as we look at our relationship with God. If God is not bound by space, then God does not have the limitations that we do regarding space. And unlike us, God can be everywhere. God is everywhere. And that is a wonderful thing. And so this is put perhaps the most memorable, most touching way this is put is in Psalm 139. Now, you may know these words if you're familiar with the Bible, the Psalms. Where can I go from your spirit, or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the light about me be night, even the darkness is not dark to you, for the night is bright as the day, for darkness is as light with you. Beautiful poetry in the scriptures, in the Psalms. But these words that you cannot ever go where God is not. Now, there is again a tone of conviction in that, isn't there? That the evildoer should be reminded. You're never out of God's sight. You can never escape the judge of all the earth. There is no stronghold against him. Walls against the Almighty are futile. He's already on the inside. But the primary thrust of it is comforting. Uh, for uh, for those who recognize that God is everywhere, and instead of trying to run from Him, utterly futile, run to Him and embrace the gospel of Jesus Christ. Believe the love of God who sent His Son to be our Savior, to die for our sins, to rise again to bring us life. Then it becomes the greatest comfort when you have taken refuge in the Almighty, to know that He is with you wherever you go. That no matter where life takes you, no matter where He sends you, He goes with you wherever you go. And whatever situation you find yourself in, He is with you there. He is always there, and He is always uh, loving and able to comfort His children. He is always wise and able to guide us. He is always strong and able to provide and to deliver in any and every situation. So the supremacy of God over space, His immensity, His omnipresence, can be the greatest comfort for His children as we go through this life. The God who calls us to Himself goes with us wherever He sends us and will bring us safely home to be with Him forever. May the Lord bless you as you go through your day and draw you ever nearer to himself, who is ever near to those who call on him.